Welcome to the January 10th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Dan Isaacson, and I'm the chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. I'd like to begin tonight with our land acknowledgement statement, and for that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Commissioner Beeson.
Okay, thank you. Since time immemorial, the Kalapuya people have been the indigenous stewards to our region, building dynamic communities, maintaining balance with wildlife, and enacting sustainable land practices. This land acknowledgement is a way of resisting the erasure of indigenous histories and to honor Native communities by inviting truth and reconciliation. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government, forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. As we consider the impacts of colonization, we also acknowledge the strength and resiliency of displaced indigenous people. The city of Eugene is built within the traditional homelands known as the Kalapuya Ilahi. Kalapuya descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. They continue to make contributions in our communities here and across the lands. We express our respect for the inherent political sovereignty of all federally recognized tribal nations and indigenous people who live in the state of Oregon and across the nation. Therefore, the Planning Commission recognizes that what we do today will affect the many generations who will come after us.
You're on mute.
Excuse me. Well, thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format that enables the Planning Commission to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public at large safe. Tonight, we are holding a second public hearing on the Willamette River Greenway Code amendments, which include proposed changes to the city's land use code. Anyone wishing to access and participate in the meeting can do so by following the access instructions listed in the agenda for this meeting. Planning Commission meetings can also be viewed by watching the live stream available on our website or on broadcast on Comcast Channel 21. If you'd like to speak or provide testimony tonight, please know that we will begin the testimony portion of tonight's meeting after our presentation and update from staff. When we reach that point, staff will provide instructions about the virtual hearing format and how to participate. Before we start, I'd like to let you know a little bit about the Planning Commission and our role in the process. First, we are unpaid volunteers appointed by the Eugene City Council who all live and work in Eugene. And like many of you, for this code amendment project, we are not the decision makers. Rather, we will review the proposed amendments, testimony, and other relevant materials before we resume our deliberations at subsequent meetings. We will then make a recommendation to City Council, who will then hold their own public hearing before making a final decision. We're at-large members, which means we have to consider the needs of the community as a whole, as well as the needs of all groups and neighborhoods. We're also human beings, which means that each one of us has our personal views that make us who we are. As planning commissioners, we're committed to balancing the needs of all of our community and to making the best recommendations we possibly can based on our own policies and laws for us and for future generations. That can be pretty tough to do, and we know that not everyone will agree with every recommendation we make. So as far as we proceed this evening, we want you to know upfront that we are listening and that we care deeply about you and our community. We recognize how important these decisions and changes are and encourage everyone speaking tonight to do so in a respectful and productive way. Before we start the hearing, I'd like to thank everyone for their patience and flexibility as we work through this virtual meeting format. As always, feel free to contact staff if there is a testimony that you were not able to provide and wish to provide to the Planning Commission in a different manner. For tonight's hearing, we'll begin with a presentation from staff and then open the hearing. Gabe Flock will now begin the staff presentation on the Willamette River Greenway Code amendments. Gabe.
Well, thank you and good evening, commissioners. My name is Gabe Flock. I am the principal planner and project manager for the Willamette River Greenway Code amendments. And I'm joined tonight by Jeff Gepper, senior planner and He'll also help provide some of the additional detail in the project overview before we start the public hearing. 1 second here, if you don't mind. I am having a momentary technical difficulty. I apologize. Okay. All right. So if you recall, following the first public hearing in March of last year and deliberation meetings held in June and August, staff did take a step back, carefully considered the public input and Planning Commission direction to date. We made some fairly significant changes and updates to the original code amendment proposal. So this second public hearing will provide an opportunity for public input on these changes before we proceed with deliberations or any formal recommendation from the commission to city council. We do recognize there's a lot of community-wide interest in these amendments, and given the input to date, we appreciate the opportunity to present what we believe are several major improvements since the initial draft code was presented in early 2022. Staff believes these changes are both responsive to public input, particularly based on what we heard from the River Road Community Organization and other interested parties about the need for additional greenway protections. As we talked about before, we're also looking to strike the right balance between those interests and the need to create an effective set of development standards that help to remove barriers to new housing, while also meeting the intent of statewide planning goal 15 to protect the greenway. We'll talk more about the history and intent of goal 15 as it relates to these amendments later on in the presentation. So as we proceed with considering these changes, staff expects the need to carefully address additional testimony and further revisions to the draft code. Later on this evening, we'll talk more about the various requests for more time we've heard in testimony over the last week, and an open record period to allow for additional testimony and other procedural next steps. With that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to Jeff for some more background and a project refresher, and then we'll get into more detail on some of the draft code changes before we start the hearing.
Excellent. Thanks, Gabe. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Jeff Gepper, and I'm here just to provide a little bit of background on the project and discuss some of the changes that have been made. So the Willamette River Greenway Code Amendments, the purpose of this project is to create a clear and objective set of approval criteria when somebody is proposing housing within the Willamette River Greenway. And really the base of that is to, one, comply with state law. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, or meet the obligations of state law, reduce barriers to housing development, and then maintain a balanced approach to protecting the Greenway with some very effective development standards for housing. So that's what, foundationally, that's what this project is all about. And really quickly, I want to go back and really touch base on Goal 15 and the Willamette River Greenway itself. And I apologize, I'm going to sometimes call it the Greenway, I'll sometimes call it the Willamette Greenway or the Willamette River Greenway. We've done our best to create consistency, always calling it the Willamette River Greenway, but old habits do die hard. So Goal 15 roots back to 1976. And it really was a measure that recognized the importance of the Willamette River as a resource, and particularly those lands that run along the Willamette River as really vital aspects of the communities that they run through. And so one of the key tenets of Goal 15 was actually the acquisition of land along the Greenway. And so that's one of the reasons why you'll see within Eugene, we publicly owned land along the Greenway is the vast majority of it. That's why we have a very world-class bicycling and pedestrian path network that runs right along its banks. And so that was one of the big pieces of Goal 15, was allowing public agencies or in cities and counties and municipalities to acquire this land. And the other one was to establish compatibility review within the Greenway. And so, those were really the foundational aspects of Goal 15. And then the other thing I just want to mention is looking at what the Greenway is within Eugene, because I do believe that there is potentially some confusion around what the greenway is and how it acts. So the greenway is what you see right now, the map on the screen. The blue areas, that's the greenway review boundaries. So anything within those areas, that's considered the greenway. So it's not just that strip of land that runs along the river. It's this entire swath of land that was adopted in 1976 by the city. So that's anything within that area is up for review in terms of compatibility to ensure that any development is compatible with the basic tenets of Goal 15. And so I'll just touch on that a little bit more to say that the Willamette River Greenway is not intended to prohibit or preclude development. The Greenway itself is really there to say development is going to occur in these areas. Let's just ensure that we support things like access to and from the river. We have a good vegetative fringe. So these are a lot of the aspects of Goal 15 that are important during our compatibility review. And so when we look at how the Greenway operates within the city of Eugene, whenever we have an intensification of use or a development proposal that's occurring within the boundaries of this Greenway, it triggers the need for a Willamette Greenway permit. Now, to date, we have used the approval criteria for the Willamette Greenway. So essentially the rules that we apply when we're looking at the Greenway permits, they came straight out of the state law, essentially. And for that reason, they do contain some subjective language that I'll talk about in a minute. But they really are, they're asking us to consider the compatibility of a development against these rules to see if whatever is being proposed is providing adequate setbacks from the river and providing enough vegetation and providing access along and to the river. So that's really looking at kind of how this is working within the city of Eugene. We've been processing these for since 1976 for any of these intensifications and developments within the Greenway. However, we have a change in state law, which came in a little while ago with the clear and objective housing requirements. So this is a state law that requires local governments to adopt clear and objective standards for any type of housing that's being built. And so that's, when I say any housing, I'm talking about a single unit dwelling, I'm talking about apartment complexes, middle housing, any form of housing needs to be subject to clear and objective standards, conditions, and procedures. And so right now, as I mentioned, the Greenway standards as they are pretty subjective. They have phrasing like to the maximum extent practicable, establish adequate setbacks to the greatest degree possible. And these phrases are inherently subjective. It requires a person to make a judgment on what those mean. And so really what this project is looking to do is to establish clear and objective rules that we can apply within the Greenway for housing proposals. And so what that would look like is we would be creating, just like we did for planned unit developments, subdivisions, and partitions. Just recently, we finally closed up the process for the clear and objective procedures for those applications. We're doing the same thing here for the Greenway. And so what it does is it says, if you're proposing housing within the Willamette Greenway, you would be able to choose between a clear and objective option. You can be judged against the clear and objective standards that we're proposing, or you can go the traditional route through the existing subjective track. And so the existing subjective track is going to stay there. If you have a proposal that doesn't include housing, you're going to the existing track for subjective application procedures. Whereas if you are doing housing, you'll have the option of choosing between the two depending on which you would like to be subject to. And so looking at what the Willamette Greenway Code amendments are, just fundamentally, we are looking at establishing, and this is just for the clear and objective track, we are looking at creating a 100-foot Greenway setback. So that's, if you have the edge of the river, you have the top of the bank. From the top of the bank, you would measure 100 feet. And we're going to be adopting a map that shows exactly where that is. You would have a limit on the length of building facades to facilitate views to and from the river. That's the same rule that kind of applies for limitations on walls and fencing. That's one of the parts of Goal 15 is to make sure that people have access both physically and visually to the river. And speaking of access, we also have pedestrian access requirements for multi-unit developments. We have a native landscape buffer. You can see that in green here that would run along the greenway setback line, and that's native plantings and tree requirements for that area. And then finally, we have tree preservation, which was a great suggestion coming out of the community organization and one of the big changes that we were adding into this. One thing that I will say the Willamette Greenway Code amendments are not, and I want to just really reiterate this. The boundary of the Willamette Greenway is not changing. The uses that are permitted within the Greenway already exist and are already allowed. Those uses are fundamentally not changing. And then finally, the existing subjective track is still there as an option for people to go down. So this new clear and objective track is intended for housing development within the Greenway. And it's intended to really help us comply with the obligations of state law to have that clear and objective option. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Gabe to briefly touch on some of the key updates and changes.
Right, thanks, Jeff. So one of the most significant changes to the draft code since we last met is the addition of tree preservation standards, which Jeff mentioned. And this is to both the clear and objective approval criteria as well as the discretionary standards for greenway permits. We believe this is an opportunity to provide an effective tool for addressing concerns about compatibility of new development in the Greenway and protecting that vegetative fringe along the river, in keeping with the intent of Goal 15 and much of the testimony that we've heard to date about the need for better Greenway protections overall. Jeff will dive into more detail here in a moment to help provide a better understanding of how these standards will work in the context of Greenway permit applications. We also heard a lot of interest in keeping the requirement for public hearings on all Greenway permits as opposed to the initial proposal, which would have pared back the process to an administrative review, or what we call a type 2 process. As we've talked about in prior deliberations, we think this change to maintain the required type 3 process will not only simplify the overall adoption process at the state level, but it also affords a type of robust public input on individual development proposals to which Eugenians are accustomed to. The proposed Greenway setback is another topic of much discussion and careful consideration to date. In prior deliberations, we did respond to testimony requesting a greater setback at a distance of 200 feet. And through those discussions and additional mapping work, we landed on maintaining the proposed 100-foot setback distance, and that is essentially for new structures. But with the addition of additional protections through those tree preservation requirements for an additional 300 feet or more landward from the Greenway setback. The refinements we did make to the draft code make it abundantly clear, though, that the only new structures allowed within the setback will be pathways in support of water-related uses along the river. Based on Commission input to date, we also removed the prohibition on parking areas between buildings and the Greenway setback, primarily to eliminate conflicts with other code standards that generally require buildings with frontage on adjacent streets. This change is one that we discussed in detail during prior deliberations and heard a majority of support for revising the draft code such that parking areas would be allowed between new buildings and the setback. The draft code also includes a change that further limits the maximum length of building facades near the river to a maximum of 75 feet within 100 feet of the Greenway setback. This change, we think, is also responsive to testimony we've heard. We think it'll help better protect views to and from the river consistent with Goal 15. The topic of native landscape buffer requirements was also discussed at length, and the testimony we heard was generally in support of that. to ensure the addition of effective screening with additional native plantings along the greenway setback. Following the input we heard from the commission, we kept the standards substantially the same in the draft code, but we also realized there may be interest in revisiting the topic, whether it's to provide a wider buffer area itself or taller shrub height and the like. We wanted to emphasize that this buffer can only include appropriate native species for the area along the river, similar to the proposed tree mitigation and replacement requirements. So Jeff will discuss this in a little more detail when we cover the standards, the tree standards, and how we rely on the adopted plant list that the city has relied on for some years now. And then finally, we did also do some additional mapping work to address walkability from the existing public access points along the river, and concerns about how the clear and objective access requirements will work related to the 500-foot distance measurement. The goal of these mapping refinements is to provide a clear and user-friendly tool for determining when and where the new standards will apply as part of the clear and objective mapping, which we intend to adopt with the draft code. Again, Jeff will dive into this topic in a little more detail, and with that, I'll turn it back to him.
Excellent, thanks, Gabe. So I'm sure this is one of the biggest items and the biggest changes that you saw within the draft code, which is our tree preservation and removal standards. We were excited to really add these and get these into the Greenway process, because it is an area that had been missing previously. So this is a positive outcome based on the kind of iterative process we've been going through. So tree preservation, we are adding the tree preservation standards to both the proposed clear and objective track as well as the subjective track. I'll talk about which ones are being added to which, but first I just want to touch base why. We're adding those to both of these because there's an important thing here to balance, which is if you make one option or one track, if you make the clear and objective track too difficult, people will always go discretionary. So we want to add balance and symmetry between the two different tracks in order to ensure that we have tree preservation in both. No matter which way you go, you're going to be required to address those standards. That said, for the existing subjective track, we put in our subjective tree criteria. And so those are the ones that also apply within things like our planned unit developments in town, our subdivisions, and all those other applications that people currently apply for. For the proposed clear and objective track, that's where we went into a little bit more nuanced model. And that is to say that we used, rightfully so, the thoroughly vetted clear and objective tree preservation standards. For the commissioners that were around at that time and the commissioners that have reviewed the most recent clear and objective ordinance that just got readopted, there was a really robust tree preservation methodology that was written into those code provisions. And so in taking advantage of that, we said, well, we should do something similar here with the Willamette Greenway. So instead of using an elevation-based tree preservation standards like we did for the South Hills area, we said, okay, well, let's make it river-centric. That's the point here. And so we established these tree preservation zones so that you have varying degrees of tree preservation based on your proximity to the river. And so what that looks like is, it really does mirror, like I said, when we said we took advantage of the other standards, we really did, we mirrored how those operated. And that was a large part out of the suggestion that came out of the River Road Community Organization. So looking at tree preservation zone 1, so that's the first 100 feet on the other side of the Greenway setback, you have a minimum preservation of 50% and a mitigation of 0%. And then tree preservation 2 has 50-50, and then tree preservation zone 3 is 40 to 100. And I'll show you an example of kind of some site-specific things of what this looks like. But first, I just really want to quickly touch on what preservation and mitigation mean, because that's not obvious to anybody unless you're reading the code constantly. So let me just look at the tree preservation zone 2. You've got 50% preservation and 50% mitigation. So if I have 10 trees on my property, I'm required no matter what to preserve 50% of those trees. So I have 5 trees left. And then of those 5 remaining trees, I'm allowed to mitigate 50%. So that means I'm allowed to remove 50% of my preserved trees and replace them as dictated through the tree preservation standards. So you could remove up to, I think that's 7 trees, but there's going to be a bunch of replacement that's triggered under that. And we actually provided a site-specific example that walks you exactly through that methodology within your AIS. And I encourage anybody who's interested to see kind of how that works exactly. There's a great figure and a walkthrough of how those operate. And so looking at just kind of how this would look, on the ground, here's just a section in the River Road neighborhood. You can see here we've got, this is the Ruth Baskin, the West Bank Path bike pedestrian area. You can see it within the Greenway setback area, and that's pretty much a no-touch zone. There's the only things that are allowed in there are public access ways and pedestrian paths, and then water-based uses. And then once you get to, you can see zone 1 here is the first 100 feet. So that's the highest preservation area, zone 2. And then zone 3 actually extends from where that is to the edge of the Willamette Greenway boundary. You'll see that on the second one. But you can see that, that most of the city-owned property typically throughout Eugene is covered by the Greenway setback. And then the tree preservation zones are really what start to more heavily impact the private land and the developable land that's outside of the parkland itself. Because to be clear, the parkland as part of these code amendments is not proposed to change or be sold or anything like that. And so here's another example. Again, this is right near Razor Avenue. You can see the public path up here. Just another example of where you can see just how far this kind of extends for the first, the tree preservation zones. The stricter ones extend 200 feet into the properties, and then zone 3, which is still a decent amount of tree preservation, extends, but it stops at the Willamette Greenway boundary. So if you're outside of the Willamette Greenway, these rules don't apply. I want to make that very clear. So that is essentially the tree preservation zones and how they're intended to operate. The key here was really finding a way to link the tree preservation to the tenets of Goal 15, one of which is to ensure a positive vegetative fringe. And really inherently what this does is it pushes development further away from the river, because you're going to just be preserving more trees as you get closer to the river. And so with that, I'm going to move on to our pedestrian access standards. So one of the basic things of Goal 15 is to provide access to and along the river. And like I said earlier, a large part of it was also for the cities to acquire land to promote that. And so we did, and so we have this really great trail system that runs along there. And so how do we provide access to that trail system and to those public lands that are on the river? And you can see here in a previous study, we actually identified all of the existing access points that provide you access to the river path system. And what this the pedestrian access standards are really looking to do is look at whether or not a development is going to be required to provide an access way or a public path through their property that essentially would allow for the city to develop a pathway that goes through there and connects a street or other road to the path itself. And so in order to make this as clear and objective as possible, what we did was we did a walkability analysis with the help of Cameron McCarthy to look at 500 feet within these access points that we found. And using that, we identified tax lots that are either not within 500 feet or they are within 500 feet. If you're within 500 feet, these rules don't apply because you've got a path right there typically, or at least an access point. If you're outside of that and you're developing multi-unit housing, these standards will apply. And so that at that point, we would have to make essentially proportional constitutional findings that this access way is necessary in this location. And the real trick here is that we're adopting this tax lot layer with the GIS layer that we're going to have our greenway setback on to make it really user friendly, so that people, when they're going to develop a property, they can go look at this map and they can say, yes, it applies, or no, it doesn't. and then they can move on. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for folks to identify whether their tax lots are included. And so with that, I'm running a little behind, so I'm going to just scoot through this. But looking at what's next, we've got our public hearing this evening. Staff has recommended that the Planning Commission continues to receive written comment through at least January 20th, because you have Planning Commission deliberations scheduled for January 24th and February 14th. And we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to continue to submit written comment. I've seen a few come in just as I've been sitting here. And then following deliberations, however long those take, we will move on to the Planning Commission recommendation. And then lastly, the City Council public hearing and action and that process, which is a whole nother public hearing opportunity to provide written comment. I'll reiterate to anybody that's watching today, this is a legislative process. We will continue to collect written comment, and that will be provided to the decision makers, even if it's after the Planning Commission's recommendation, the decision maker in this case being the City Council. And if you want to submit that, you can send written comments to greenway.testimony@eugene-or.gov. That's a surefire way for it to reach us here, and we provide in batches to our decision makers and Planning Commission. You can mail comment to us here at the Atrium Building, or you can join us for the Planning Commission public hearing or the City Council public hearing and provide verbal testimony. And with that, I am going to pass it back to Chair Isaacson for the rest of the public hearing, and I appreciate the opportunity to share tonight.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Gabe. Well, now I'd like to open the public hearing. As staff just presented, if you'd like to speak and have not already raised your hand, please raise your hand virtually now to get into the queue. I see we have a few people who have already done so. Testimony presented at this public hearing should be directed toward the applicable approval criteria or other criteria that the speaker believes apply to the decision. The applicable approval criteria for this proposed land use code amendments are in Eugene Code Section 9.8065. In general terms, the approval criteria require that the proposed changes are consistent with the applicable statewide planning goals, the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan, the Metro Plan, and applicable adopted refinement plans. Now, moderator, how many speakers do we currently have in the queue?
So we currently have 5 speakers in the queue.
Okay. Well, based on the number of speakers in the queue, each speaker will be given 3 minutes to speak. We encourage each of you to submit any written testimony you have as well. I will turn it over to our moderator to begin public testimony.
Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Baker, and I'm going to provide instructions on how to request to speak during the public testimony section. You can get in the queue by raising your virtual hand. To do this, please click the raise hand button in the menu if you're joining us on computer, tablet, or smart device. If you're joining us by phone, you must dial *9. At the beginning of testimony, you should start by stating your name, address, and whether you're in support, opposition, or neutral to the proposal. Public testimony time is 3 minutes long. I will provide you a time reminder when you have 30 seconds left to speak, and once the time is up, you will be returned to attendee status. If any technical difficulties are encountered, we will move on to the next person in the queue and try again after that person's comment. With these instructions out of the way, Jolene Spencer will be our first person tonight, with Jan Spencer next. All right, so hold on one moment. Jolene, I'm going to add you as a panelist.
Hi, am I ready to start?
You are.
Okay, hi, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Jolene Simpson. I live at 190 Hawthorne Avenue in Eugene, 97404. I'm a River Road resident for approximately 37 years, and I have used the bike path, the river path, almost daily, every year that I've lived here, every day of my life, really. So I feel like I'm intimately acquainted with the Greenway. So I'm going to read from my prepared testimony to the Planning Commission, Eugene City Councilors, Eugene City Mayor. Today, you have an opportunity to fulfill the intention of the statewide Goal 5 and Goal 15 conservation measures and institute planning code and guidance that will add some key protections to the Willamette River Greenway. The Greenway is a precious resource representing a vital life-giving link in the Willamette Valley ecosystem for birds, salmon, mussels, beaver, and insects, as well as for countless native trees, plants, and shrubs. Large native canopy trees breathe oxygen into our atmosphere and offset the effect of heat islands in our hardscaped world. The Greenway offers solace to people in our community who are seeking peace, recreation, inspiration, and opportunities for spiritual growth in a natural world, a space outside and away from concrete, auto traffic, noise pollution, and other assaults to the senses. Despite the obvious need to preserve this precious space for now and for future generations, much time and opportunity has already been lost. Now is the time to act boldly and codify a few vital rules in order to mitigate the damage that could be incurred by further human development. Specifically, I recommend enlarging the 10-foot buffer zone for native plantings to 20 feet and include a requirement for level 3 type landscaping with species native to the Western United States. Knowing that the critical root zone for trees requires at least 1 foot of root space for every 1 inch of trunk, 10 feet is clearly not enough to adequately accommodate and protect healthy native heritage tree growth and canopy development. Number 2, adopt a set of standards that are clear and objective and discard the so-called discretionary pathway, a pathway that has led previously to egregious development within the Greenway, development which is not in alignment with statewide planning goals 5 and 15. Number 3, assure that public lands and pathways remain in public control. Advise government agencies to invest in future purchases of land within the Greenway to be preserved for public use. Develop standards that protect the natural ambiance and viewshed of the Greenway. Include and codify a designation for conservation easements within the Greenway in order to provide an avenue to further protect land that is held privately and could be subject to future development or redevelopment. And number 4, extend this process of deliberation of Greenway protections to include consideration and inclusion of key points of the draft RRCO neighborhood plan, a plan reflecting hundreds of hours of community input with an entire section.
All right, so the next person that we have in the queue is Jan Spencer. On 1 minute.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, okay. This is a little bit of a new process for me. I've used Zoom plenty, but not exactly like this. Thanks everyone here for your care about the community. I would like to endorse what Jolene just said. I would like to also endorse the comments from the River Road Community Organization. Just have a little couple comments that aren't technical right here. Many of us are here this evening to support the greatest possible protections for the Greenway. For me, the Greenway is my primary location of travel by non-motorized bicycle along the Pikeway in the Greenway. I bought my house 22 years ago in River Road primarily because of the Greenway. I participated in dozens of work parties in the Greenway over the years, like river cleanups in Razor Park, the Filbert Grove, helped building the information kiosk, Heron Slough, Maynard Park, and other locations in the Greenway and River Road. I have a formal agreement with the city to help look after the Filbert Grove in the Greenway. And Um, yeah, and I appreciate enormously City of Eugene staff who have been extremely helpful. Lorna Baldwin, Kelsey, the city staff who have helped with work parties in the Greenway are shining examples of what the city can do to empower people in the community to help look after public property. I can certainly recognize there's not enough money for the city to do all these projects. The city shouldn't be doing all these projects. Citizens should be doing a lot of these type of projects, like in the Filbert Grove and Razor Park and other places. There are enormous community building opportunities, and protecting the Greenway will help inspire more people to become actively involved in looking after the Greenway. So again, I would like to endorse what Jolene just said, and I would endorse the comments from River Road Community Organization as well. That's it. Thank you.
Jan, I have one quick question. What is your address?
212 Benjamin.
Okay. And are you in opposition or support?
I'm in support of the greatest protections possible. For example, a more clear and descriptive procedure rather than discretionary, and the idea of public access, setbacks, protection of trees, all of that. I'm in favor of the maximum possible.
All right, thank you for your testimony.
Okay.
The next person that we have in the queue is Jonathan Belcher, and I will promote you to panelist. Hold on one moment.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Belcher, or John Belcher. I live at 1243 Rome Lane in Eugene. So here goes. Although I am the co-chair of the River Road Community Organization and the co-chair of the Community Advisory Committee for the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood planning process, which informs my testimony, I am speaking as an individual. And the references folks made to the River Road Community Organization testimony are inaccurate. They're referring to my testimony. Okay. First of all, I joined planning staff in requesting the public record be left open for an additional 10 days. I appreciate the proposed changes in this version of the code, and in the interest of making it even better, I will make the following requests. I doubt I'll reach all my written testimony, so please follow that as well. Okay. Primarily, to my knowledge, the Planning Commission is unaware that this code adoption process has been proposed by the Eugene planning staff to be the venue to deliberate and develop proposed code to implement the draft neighborhood plan goals for the Willamette Greenway within the boundaries of our neighborhood association. Because of this issue, the River Road Executive Board has unanimously voted, with one abstention by Commissioner Isaacson, to request the Planning Commission continue the January 10th hearing on these amendments beyond tonight, or agree that a future hearing will be held to provide adequate opportunity to accommodate the planning staff's requests that this process include those proposals from the neighborhood plan. I request, assuming you do that, I request the Greenway goals from the draft plan be evaluated by the Planning Commission with representatives from the Neighborhood Community Advisory Committee to develop appropriate revisions to be incorporated within these clear and objective amendments. I'll reiterate the problem of retaining the discretionary path. Our experience has been that because of the arbitrary nature of the standards as mentioned by staff, basically hearings officials allow anything that's requested by developers. And as long as that remains that way, it's going to be a problem. So therefore, I request the commission direct staff to review the Willamette Greenway discretionary code to determine whether all criteria in that code has created provisions in the clear and objective code that addresses those criteria as well. I found 3 that I think are still not sufficiently covered. You'll see that in my testimony. Therefore, if it's unfeasible to revise the discretionary path and provide enforceable criteria to match this clear and objective path, I request that the discretionary path for housing be deleted from the land use code. Yeah, I'm running out of time, but there's further testimony there. We have some concerns about whether or not the proposed new tree preservation zones are actually on private land. A lot of it, we believe, at least in our neighborhood, is on public land, and that creates some issues that I speak to in my testimony, along with numerous other things. So thank you very much.
So the next speaker, let's see, is Julie Holme. Hold on one moment and I will promote you.
Good evening. My name is Julie Hume, and I live at 455 and a half River Road. I've been a resident at this address for the last 39 years, and we own approximately 2 acres of property here that are fully within the Willamette River Greenway. I'd like to begin by thanking you for extending the public record until January 20th. I'd also like to urge the Planning Department and the Eugene Planning Commission to avoid scheduling such critical issues as the Willamette River Greenway immediately following major holidays. Doing so has really seriously impacted meaningful public engagement. I have submitted written testimony with technical points, so I'm going to use my brief time to share some other ideas. The Willamette River Greenway is the crown jewel of our community, and our guiding principle in developing code should be one of stewardship of this precious resource, honoring the past and the future. The Willamette River Greenway is home to numerous native species of flora and fauna. It's a life-saving resource for physical and mental health during the COVID pandemic. And it's a varied resource for recreation and transportation, and frankly, a soul-sustaining interface with nature available to all. We need to approach preservation of the Greenway with a resolve to add more open space via land purchases, developing a system of local conservation easements for private landowners that have land within the Greenway. We need to increase the tree canopy to aid in climate mitigation, to avoid heat islands created by pavement, and stop adding impervious surfaces, which allow for pollutants to enter the river and increase the risk of flood hazards and extreme weather events. We need affordable housing and a protected Greenway. Creative solutions such as incentivizing accessory dwelling units in the River Road neighborhood offer a path to meeting both these goals in our community. My hope is that we can all use our heads and our hearts to protect the Willamette River Greenway, as our code that is being developed may well become a template for other communities. Thank you.
And Julie, I have a quick question. Can you let me know whether you're in support, opposition, or neutral to the proposal?
I support clear and objective standards and maximum preservation of the Willamette River Greenway. Thank you.
All right, with that, our next speaker is Hope Vacher, and I will promote you to panelist. Hold on one moment, okay? So Hope, are you able to connect?
Yes. Just didn't know when I was supposed to start. Is now the time?
Now's the time.
Thank you. I live at 1210 East 29th Place. And I've lived in Eugene since around 1980. And everybody who has spoken before me are the experts. All of these people who live along the Greenway and have for decades and have been protecting it and using it have explained the importance of the maximum protections for the Greenway. I support everything the four people before me have spoken about. I also am opposed to retaining the discretionary standards. It's too much of a political way for developers to get what they want without considerations for other important issues and things like that. I also, in reading the proposal, I have found areas that don't appear to be clear and objective, and I know that that's the intent here. So I just wanted to point a few of those out. So there's language in the ordinance that includes the following phrases. Substantially alters, it's not defined. So under change of use, only a change that requires construction, etc., and that substantially alters or affects the land or water. There's no definition. The ordinance also doesn't appear to define usual and necessary. So placement of basically the language in the ordinance is subsidiary structures. I believe that's accessory structures. So again, the proposed code language would allow placement of accessory structures as are usual and necessary to such use and enjoyment. Again, there's not really a definition. It seems discretionary. Also doesn't define, this part was very confusing to me, maybe not to people who live along the Greenway, but the ordinance doesn't define or provide examples of goods and services that are directly associated with water-dependent land or waterways use or public loss of quality. I personally don't know what that means. Does not appear clear and objective. I know I'm running out of time. The ordinance also doesn't appear to define the greatest possible degree, which is used under criteria for development within the Willamette River boundaries. So I do have written comments, and I will put those into the record. And
all right, so with that, our next speaker is Sue. I'm going to promote you to panelist, but I really appreciate if you'd also provide your last name. Sue, are you there?
I'm sorry.
You're fine.
I'm Sue Schaefer. I've lived at 118 East Hilliard Lane for 30 years, and I'm a block from the river. And I think the 100-foot setback is way too little. I look at the Velo apartments that went in recently. They're very close, I think 100 feet, and they're totally in your face. I think the city might have to accept that there will be fewer units on a parcel in order to give the Greenway what it deserves. And I think that's what I have to say.
All right, so I'm going to return you to being an attendee. Hold on one moment.
Okay.
And let's see. So with that, we do have one more speaker, but it's someone who's already spoken before. So if you have any additional, let's see. Oh, actually we have, we just had 2 more speakers. So hold on one moment. All right, so our next speaker will be Savannah, and I would really appreciate it if you would also provide your last name. Yeah. Oh, did I just, oh.
Okay, my last name is Savannah. I live at 350 Pearl Street. I am in support of the clear and objective standards and opposed to the subjective. I support the River Road community organization's recommendations. And I have a couple of questions. I assume that the standards that are if in preservation of the Greenway are also apply to the construction process itself when a proposed development has been approved and they begin to break ground. I don't know for sure if this is true, but I would like to know if it is, and if so, how these standards are kept in compliance, how they're overseen, because the construction process can cause and create a great deal of pollution to the waterway itself. And that's a big concern to me because I know development is going to happen. We have such a huge demand on housing in Eugene. So those are my questions. Thank you.
All right. And our next speaker is Lindsay Leach. And hold on one moment, I will promote you to panelist.
Hello, I'm Lindsay Leach. I'm the new interim city councilor for Ward 7. I just wanted to join today to let everyone here know I am listening. And as a person who lives within the Greenway, I'm very invested in protecting our beautiful riverfront. And I greatly appreciate everyone here who has spoken. I really encourage you to come to the additional public forum at the City Council later this month. And if you have any questions or want to reach out to me specifically, please do email or give me a phone call. So again, I appreciate the commissioners and the city staff that have put together this presentation. It's obvious that you took in information from the last forums and have tried to incorporate that. So I just wanted to say I appreciate that and everyone who's here today.
And our next speaker is Phil Farrington. Hold on one moment and I'll promote you to panelist.
You're muted, Phil.
One more button hit. Thank you. Hi, I'm Phil Farrington. I live at 1160 Monroe Street. I've been working as a planner in a parks planner starting, and then as a planner throughout the community for the last 30 years. I've worked in a number of capacities on greenway permits on behalf of the city, developing the East Bank Bike Path program and that greenway permit for the expansion of Watson Stadium and for other developments in Eugene and Springfield. I think the greenway permit program and even the differences neighborhood by neighborhood are reflected in neighborhood plans in a meaningful way. I think the needs are different in different parts of the greenway, in different parts of the community. The one that I've been providing testimony to the Planning Commission about is the squirrely kind of area that is partly in the greenway, but also bisected from the river by the Union Pacific Railroad tracks. I appreciate the changes that have been made thus far by staff, and the Planning Commission has been considering changes since this process first started a year ago. I would encourage you, though, to make an acknowledgement through these standards, both in the criteria that are existing and or the subjective or the subjective criteria or the clear and objective path, that acknowledgement be made as there is already in the code relating to roads and streets that might isolate an area within a water resources overlay area, that similarly there be acknowledgement that there are areas that are in the greenway that are bisected from the river and isolated from it by virtue of the train tracks. Establishing more rigid tree protection standards and criteria for removal and mitigation in those areas really, I think, is going to be a little bit, I would call it kind of gilding the lily. I think it's really, there's already standards that are in place that we would have to comply with for development along the water resources area for the mill race. Those are the ones that I think are more ecologically relevant and should be observed and will be with future development. So I just want you to kind of consider that and consider if there isn't a carve out that would be done to acknowledge the difference in this area from others throughout the community. I really appreciate your consideration, your service to the community on the commission, and all the passion that everybody has that's expressed it in all of the testimony that you received throughout this whole process and ongoing. The Greenway certainly is the gem of our community, and we want to protect it and preserve it. Thank you very much for your time.
Excellent. And that concludes our list of speakers. We do have one hand that's still raised. It was a person who's already spoken tonight. I'll remind everybody that each person gets one chance to speak, but I do want to give this person a chance to they might have a clarifying question about maybe process or something like that. I don't want to leave that unaddressed just in case. So Hope, if you would ask your question, I'm happy to answer or do that during staff response.
Thank you very much, but I need to apologize. I tried to put my hand down, but it didn't go down.
Just didn't want to cut you off there if you had a specific question. Thank you very much for being here tonight. And I'll just say that concludes our list of speakers for this evening.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for taking the time out of your evening to share your thoughts with us. The public hearing is now closed. Staff has recommended that the Planning Commission continue to accept written testimony through 5 p.m. on January 20th, 2023. Written testimony received after that date will not be considered by the Planning Commission, but will be provided to the City Council for their consideration. But I would like to entertain a motion to do so, to make that formal. Can I have a motion from the floor? Looks like Commissioner Edwards makes that motion. I need a second, please.
So moved, sorry.
Second. Yeah, I have Commissioner Lear seconding the motion. All those in favor of continuing and opening the deliberations, or excuse me, the written testimony, signify by raising your hand. Okay, motion, Commissioner, thank you, Mr. Commissioner Bailey. It is unanimous. Thank you very much. Is there a staff response to the testimony offered this evening?
Well, thank you, Chair Isaacson. I would like to express appreciation on behalf of the city for everyone that took time out of their evening tonight to testify. And, you know, honestly, staff is very interested in getting this right. It's been decades since we've worked on an update to the Greenway standards, and it's a tough nut to crack when it comes to meeting the obligations under state law, balancing that with the subjective track criteria that come right out of Goal 15. And so we want folks to know that we're listening, and we intend to be responsive to the substantive items that we can address, and to the extent that it makes sense, and that we can garner a planning commission recommendation that hopefully you know, a good majority supports. Now, I appreciate that we have now set the stage for the open record period. And given the amount of testimony that we've received, which is a fair amount of written material you've received via email and into the record, at this point, we expect to get more, obviously, over the next 2 weeks. And so what I would suggest or propose is that staff respond in more detail to the testimony as part of a written response and leading into the deliberations, which are scheduled for January 24th. With that said, though, we have an expert staff team here tonight, and I want to provide the opportunity for, whether it's Mr. Gepper, Lauren Summers from the City Attorney's Office, and also, you know, Terry Harding is here, and given some of the comments we heard about the relationship between these amendments and specific to the concerns of the River Road area, I thought it might be helpful to have her provide a few comments at this point. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Terry.
Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, just as a quick reintroduction, I'm Terry Harding. I'm the Principal Planner for Community Planning and Design and the current Project Manager for the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan. And so I'm here tonight serving as a liaison to that project and that process. As was stated in some of the testimony, the neighborhood planning process has included extensive discussion about the Willamette River, and there is draft policy language included in the plan, which is scheduled to come before the Planning Commission and Council later this year. I'd just like to read one of the draft policies because I think it's particularly relevant to the process that you are considering. It's draft policy 14.3, Willamette River compatibility. Encourage development that is less dense along the river by making legislative updates to local land use regulations that include additional standards to protect, maintain, preserve, and enhance the natural, scenic, historic, and recreational qualities of the Willamette River Greenway. And I'll provide that also in the staff written response to the testimony. If you have any other questions, please let me know.
Thanks, Terry. Jeff or Lauren, do you have anything you wish to add at this point? Go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gabe. I just want to take this chance to reiterate to everybody that if they're looking to submit written comment to the Planning Commission for their consideration, I'm going to go ahead and just share that email one more time really quick. It's greenwaytestimony@eugene-or.gov. And as the commission just passed a motion, we'll continue to collect those materials until 11:59 p.m. on January the 20th. Those will be batched and provided to the Planning Commission. Again, if you send it to the Greenway testimony, that's a surefire way to get it through that process. Any materials collected after that will be sent to the City Council for their consideration. So thank you for the opportunity to discuss that, and we'll provide some more detailed answers in regards to some of the other questions in our follow-up, as Gabe mentioned.
Thanks, Jeff. Before we get into commissioners' questions, the motion we just passed actually only had a 5 p.m. deadline. I wanted to check, does staff want us to revote to put it to 11:59, or do we want to adjust that to 5 p.m.?
That was my mistake. I'll amend that to be 5 p.m. and have that on the website as well for people's information.
I'm fine with 11:59 if you want to do a revote. I just want to make sure we're all.
I'll leave that up to the Planning Commission to make that judgment call.
Okay. Moving on. Commissioner Edwards, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Isaacson. I just had a couple of questions, so I'll start with the first one, and they're just, if maybe I think it might be a Lauren question, but so a lot of the testimony related to changes to the discretionary track, and I'm just curious if you could speak at this point to the authority of either the planning commission or even the ultimate decision-making body, which would be the city council, on that particular component, because I just want to get some clarification as to whether or not that is actually before us as an option.
Thanks, Commissioner Edwards. I'll kind of take first crack, and then maybe Gabe will want to jump into, because I think part of the answer has to do with legal requirements, and part of the answer has to do with the scope of this project and what it's intended to do. So the general track, the discretionary track, whatever you want to call it, the current Willamette Greenway standards in the code are in large part taken directly from the language of Goal 15, the Willamette Greenway goal, and are most of the standards are required to be, the way that Goal 15 works is the goal has a set of standards that it requires cities and counties with lands within the Greenway to adopt. And so that's what we did to be in compliance with Goal 15. We just pulled a bunch of that language directly into our code. So the idea of amending that language would significantly increase the scope of this project, both because it was intended to create a set of clear and objective standards in addition to the current Greenway criteria, and because there would be necessarily a fair amount of legal research to figure out whether we could operate only with a set of clear and objective standards, or if and which of those subjective standards we are required to have in the code, which were something that a previous policymaker decided to include a while ago. So none of that research has been done because that wasn't part of the initial scope of this project. Gabe, I'll turn it over to you now.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that could be considered as part of a legislative adoption process like this. But if you recall, the scope of this project was really born out of the clear and objective code amendments package that was passed a number of years ago and finally resolved on appeal. And so we've worked with that model and tried to bring some parity and consistency between what we're doing here with that of the clear and objective amendments. And so, the notion of completely striking the discretionary track option is one that I think we'd need to carefully consider. There may be some unintended consequences, legal consequences, and in terms of the scope of the project, it does give me some concern. At this stage of the process, I think it's probably more likely that we could consider, potentially, and this is just a thought, is that there might be some opportunity to incorporate some additional changes. Obviously, we added subjective tree preservation criteria that exists across the various application types within the code. So again, though, it would be a little bit odd in that each of the clear and objective and discretionary, each application type has both, right? And it provides developers with a choice, in the one case with the subjective standards, to have perhaps some more flexibility, or there might be a particular clear and objective standards that just can't be met on a particular site. And so it provides a little bit of a relief valve, at least from staff's perspective. It gives that choice to an applicant, whether to follow the clear and objective track or not. That said, it's a topic we'd want to carefully consider before we make a major shift at this point.
Thank you. That is really helpful. And I'll just share that I think my comfort level would be way outside of that, just given that we have not dealt with things outside of the clear and objective to this point. My other quick question, and I do think this is a Lauren question, I know that there is also a pending appeal process that deals with the Greenway, and I'm curious about the timing on that and whether or not there are implications for this process that any decision that would change whatever we do here. And so I just want to make sure that the timing would be aligned.
Great question, Commissioner Edwards. I'd be happy to speak to that. So the city's middle housing ordinance, which was adopted in June, is on appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals right now. And one of the appeal issues that was raised was whether the city should have, as part of that middle housing process, adopted clear and objective standards for middle housing in the Greenway. And so LUBA is kind of being confronted with the same question that Planning Commission is struggling with right now in terms of the relationship between the subjective requirements of Goal 15 and the statutory requirement for clear and objective standards for housing. Right now, LUBA has said that they plan to issue their decision on the middle housing appeal by January 31st. So probably before Planning Commission makes its recommendation. You received some testimony that suggested that Planning Commission should hold off on the public hearing and or your deliberations until LUBA has issued their decision. And it is my opinion and staff's opinion that that's not necessary. There are, in my mind, kind of four ways that it could go at LUBA. One is that the board avoids that they find that they don't have jurisdiction in that particular set of circumstances to answer that Goal 15 versus clear and objective standards question. And in that case, we're in exactly the same position that we are right now without any particular direction from LUBA. Another option would be that they determine that for middle housing, there's a particular path that kind of satisfies both Goal 15 and the clear and objective standards. But even if that's true for middle housing, there are other types of housing that are allowed in the Greenway. And those other types of housing would still be in the same position of clear and objective standards versus Goal 15. A third option would be that they find that clear and objective kind of always wins, in which case we would need to move forward with adopting clear and objective standards for the Greenway. And the fourth option would be that they find that Goal 15 always wins. But in that case, I would expect that decision to be appealed up to the Court of Appeals and possibly beyond. And so we wouldn't have a final decision on that question for quite some time. So for all of those reasons, it makes sense to me that Planning Commission continue to do their work on this project. Certainly once we get the decision from LUBA, I'll forward that information to Planning Commission and Council. We can put it in the record. And that may affect kind of Planning Commission's decision-making about your recommendation, but it's, I don't think it's worth holding off because in at least 3 out of the 4 cases, it still makes sense to move forward.
Okay, I think that's helpful. I guess maybe just as a follow-up, is there a potential that a decision could be made on the 31st that might change course on how this body might deliberate in a subsequent after January 24th? Meaning if the Planning Commission starts to deliberate on the 24th, we still have, more to discuss. And then on the 31st, a decision changes things. Is that a potential?
I suppose it is a potential, Commissioner Edwards. However, I guess one thing I've neglected to mention is, even if LUBA said, well, Goal 15 always wins, cities are not required to adopt clear and objective standards in the Greenway. Eugene could still choose to do that as a way to remove barriers to the development of housing, as a way to encourage the development of housing throughout the city. So again, there might be a policy decision made to move forward, even if it's not legally required.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for entertaining all of my questions.
Commissioner Bailey.
All right, I think I'll start with, the easy question first, which is the graphic on public access from Jeff's presentation was confusing to me because there are points of public access. And then I believe in green, one of the colors showed lots supposedly not within 500 feet of public access, but it appeared in the graphic that there were points of public access right there. So I don't understand the distinction of not within 500 feet in that graphic. You want to pull it back up?
I think that might be a good opportunity to provide some clarity and a follow-up written statement regarding that, because that's not the only time that it's come up, and I think it could use some further explanation beyond just my response tonight.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
Yep, fine with me. And then similar to Commissioner Edwards' questions about middle housing, I have some confusion about the overlap of the processes between our amendment consideration and the River Road area plan consideration, which obviously will have impact on what we are doing or vice versa. And I wonder about the parallel timeframes and going to the city council. And do we anticipate the area plan being completed and accepted before we reach a final decision point and agreement and recommendation on the Willamette Greenway amendments? I wonder how that relationship's going to work as we move forward.
Harry, would you like to take that?
Yeah, and I would, thank you for the question. I would like to provide additional information in writing to answer that more completely. At this point, we are not anticipating that the neighborhood plan would be to city council before the Greenway Code amendments that you're presently considering. Instead, this is an opportunity to incorporate what's in the draft plan, but it wouldn't be the end of that process, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I got that we're being asked to consider the language in the draft plan, and we can take that up in our deliberations, I assume, later this month. So that, in my mind, leaves the potential for other issues to come up down the road. We move ahead with these amendments, and then as the neighborhood area plan goes forward with its process, something else could come up that would trigger us needing to revisit the code amendments, seems to me. Is that accurate, or would that not be the case?
I'd like to formulate a response to that question and put it in our staff response.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Bailing, I would just jump in and remind the Planning Commission too that these Greenway Code amendments that you're considering now are citywide. So they would affect the Greenway anywhere it exists in the city, including the River Road area, certainly, but also other areas as well. And so I think just kind of reminding the commission and the public that that is the case, that these are very potentially expansive code amendments and apply in a lot of places.
Okay, I actually had one other little issue, which I think may also be a part of deliberations. And that is something one of the speakers referred to also about no impervious surfaces. I know we've done a revision about the parking area, and in our previous hearing and questions, Commissioner Isaacson and I both questioned, couldn't we include a requirement for pervious pavers for future parking as part of that parking issue? I think Gabe had a question about, we can't require anything that might increase cost to a builder or developer, but having personal experience with things like True Grid and other pervious pavers, I know you can do it without adding cost at all, extremely efficiently, very effectively, and I do hope we can move in that direction.
Commissioner Bailing, I would just respond by saying that, yes, we intend to follow up on that topic. I heard the testimony as well. I know it was a topic of interest. In particular, you brought that up, I think, at our last deliberation meeting. And so we'll explore that further and what that might look like in the context of the code amendments and be prepared to talk about it at our next meeting. Jake, thanks.
Commissioner Lear, and then I'm going to put myself in the queue.
Yeah, we heard a lot of public testimony directed against the discretionary path process, and concerns from folks who were speaking about that being like a handout to developers or in some way against the public interest. I guess this is kind of a broad question for staff, but is there a concern that that process has in the past been used in a way that undermined state planning goals or the public interest and that needs that type of attention? We don't have to be specific about talking about particular projects, but is that a concern that the staff has looking back? And I know, Gabe, you've been on the team for a long time. Many others have as well. I'm just trying to get more of a historical perspective there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think I would just say with confidence that the city would never ultimately approve an application that we didn't believe meets the approval criteria. And frankly, the discretionary track criteria borrow language directly from Goal 15. And so that inherent subjectivity, I think, is probably more the source of a different set of opinions and perspectives from where you might sit in the context of one of our development review or permitting processes. That said, are there things that we could modify to strengthen it or bring parity, consistency between that track and the clear and objective tools that we're trying to create? Again, I think it's a good topic of discussion. But ultimately, I don't agree with the characterization entirely. I think that there are always improvements we can make to the code. And again, as I mentioned at the outset, we haven't really revisited those discretionary standards for some time. And so I think it's appropriate to look at that question given the testimony. I'm not sure where that'll lead us in terms of scope, and I've expressed some concerns around that. But I definitely think it's an appropriate topic of discussion for deliberations.
Okay, so putting myself in the queue here, I think, Gabe, you said something really profound this evening, which is that we haven't touched on this issue in quite some time, which means in all likelihood, the decision that we're going to be making or talking about is going to be impacting for several generations before it's going to be revisited again. So yes, it probably could be revisited if there are tweaks that need to be made, but we need to be mindful of that this is pretty meaningful in terms of its impact on not just the River Road community, but to Lauren's point, the city as a whole. Last year we passed significant legislation changes by directive of the Oregon legislature to maximize density to accommodate our growth, and I supported that. But getting people into homes who move here isn't where the conversation ends. There has to be something that gives us all balance, serenity, and peace, as Julie talked about in her testimony, mental health during COVID, for example. And any list of attributes that Eugene has to offer in this area, the Willamette Greenway has to be near the top of the list. And so I'm deeply committed to ensuring that any changes keeps this in mind, even if the result is in this isolated area, fewer units of housing built. So one of the concerns that I have and other people have in the community who have worked with the city is whether their efforts through this process of engagement have borne changes in the final draft recommendations. And I believe that they have, and we've talked about them, our staff has talked about them tonight. I appreciate the slides showing that changes have been made from the initial draft to tonight's final draft. And I'm wondering if staff could take a moment to discuss a few community suggestions that did not make tonight's final draft and give insight as to why it didn't. And I want folks here tonight or watching at home to come away with a deeper understanding into what the hurdles were from staff's point of view. For example, the special area zone, public access, and private property, and that kind of thing. That's my first question.
I appreciate the question, and I think similar to some of the more complex and robust answers that we might want to provide, this is probably best left for a more detailed written response. You know, but by way of recollection, I would say that, for example, the interest in sort of ensuring that there is public input and some process around any transfer of ownership of parklands for private purposes, for example, is one that the scope of these amendments just in our land use code typically does not even touch. And so that is not to say that there aren't potential efforts that could be made to address those issues outside of the land use code, but that's one key example. We've also had a fair amount of discussion with interested parties about this notion of private access connections that extend across public land. And I think we've helped to address those concerns in understanding the way that the standards work. And with regard to public access, we have kind of the two sets of criteria. One is related to dedication of public access ways. So if you're not within 500 feet of a defined public access point, the city has the ability to make an exaction and require a new public access way. But the fallback position is that multi-family projects, regardless of that distance, definitely have to provide on-site pathways in the direction of the river, with the idea that we would not be precluding or foregoing other opportunities for some of these gaps to be addressed, you know, in terms of access from private development to the green space. Those are two that come to mind right now, and I think I'd like to take a minute to look back at the testimony and dive into that a little deeper as we get into deliberations.
Okay, thanks. Next question I have is on native trees. Who determines what a native tree is, what species are on the list, and which tree species would be selected?
Yeah, so I know there's some interest in that, and we've heard testimony about the, you know, interest in ensuring native plantings be required. And so what we have proposed in the draft code is reliance on the city's existing adopted native plants list. And it actually was created as part of our Goal 5 regulations that have been implemented and used for a number of years. And so staff's perspective is that that list is not only appropriate to the environment along the river, and that, you know, based on my experience and having been involved in that staff team, there was a lot of expertise and consultant work to help define that list at the time. And so it's one of these examples, and you may have heard me talk about this in the context of other projects, but where we can rely on existing tools that we know work, and that have been vetted in a way that the native plants list has. We want to rely on that, not only for the sake of efficiency, but also, you know, given the purpose of this project, for clarity, right? So there is an adopted discrete list of native species that we know will work for the intended purpose for native plantings. And we also drafted the code such that the new tree preservation and mitigation standards will rely on that. So within the greenway setback, only those types of native tree species can be used to mitigate anything that might have been removed on a development site. So I hope that helps as at least as a starting point for the discussion on native species.
Great. And nothing we're entertaining tonight, or even an existing code, prevents development in the greenway, correct?
Can you repeat the question?
Nothing that we're entertaining tonight prevents development. This is just developing the rules by which development potentially could occur.
I think that's a fair statement. And there might be different perspectives, or a particular site where it might not be possible to meet the clear and objective standard. And so we might not have surfaced that one example, but generally speaking, your statement is correct.
Okay. And this is my last question before we get to Commissioner Fragula, so I appreciate the patience. Yeah. Part of the confusion and concern by the public is that it's hard to conceptualize what the real world impact of these changes will have on the greenway. And a single line of suggested code may not tell the whole story in terms of what the goals are by the public and balancing the needs of those wishing to develop the property and the rightful use of the greenway. For example, in, I believe it was slide 13 of the staff presentation, an example was the 100-foot setback from top of bank. And this may seem, as we've heard from testimony, that this is not enough, and that some people feel that 100 feet doesn't protect the public's right to use with development. But as we heard from the last time we met, there are other considerations and code changes that come into play. So development really isn't really possible in a lot of areas at the 100-foot once you add in all the other changes to it. So it's really more like 150 feet from top of bank. But it would be very easy if you're only looking at that one line of code to be rightfully deeply concerned. As such, I'd like to request that we have a map that has a complete overlay of the existing and proposed code amendments that allows the public to see what tracks are developable, where it is developable, and visually how this interacts with this beloved part of our community. Does that make sense?
It does, although I do have some concerns in terms of the level of analysis and work that it would take, and in a conceptual or theoretical realm, the kind of staff's articulation or opinion about whether and how a particular property is developed at a scale of citywide amendments, you know, and to drill down and really actually look at, you know, the conceptual development potential of each property is something that I think would take a lot of work. We might not get it right, but I appreciate what you're trying to articulate with this sort of visual or graphic. Jeff, you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will point people interested in this in particular to check out on the project website. There are the supplemental maps. Particularly, there's one that identifies partially developed and undeveloped lands. And so it's not that many parcels within the Greenway are identified as such. And if you combine that tool with the online mapping tool that we have that shows the Greenway setback, you should be able to identify which tax lot that is, zoom in on it, see how far the Greenway setback that is being proposed is identified on that lot, and kind of look at that impact potential. That said, we are also working to update the web map to show the tree preservation zones, as well as just add some clarity to that web map so that people can use it, just increase usability. But hopefully those tools in themselves will also help people look at the development potential of those undeveloped and partially developed lands.
Okay, I'll probably come back to this, but I want to make sure Commissioner Bregler has a chance to speak. So let me pop over. Commissioner Bregler.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank everybody that took the time to speak tonight and that is still here listening. I know this is a very important topic to our community. I also appreciate all the work that the staff is putting into this, and I know there are multiple layers of multiple intricacy that we're navigating here. And so I appreciate all of the attempts to communicate that to a planning commission that consists primarily of individuals who are not planners. So I appreciate the efforts. I think, I mean, it's a lot of information that we're reading. I've actually gone back and reviewed the previous batches and recognized that there will be more batches coming. And I would like staff to recognize that I personally don't anticipate coming to a decision at our next deliberation meeting, and that I'm anticipating needing the February 14th deliberation date. And that I would like to be able, as I review materials, to also send additional questions that may come up. I'm guessing that's possible. Staff has always been available in the past, and I appreciate that. For me, I think in reading all of the materials, the thing that stands out most significantly and that we heard tonight in public testimony is how significant and important this resource is in our community. And I think we all recognize that, right? It's a very important piece to not only the identity, but to the well-being of the community. And so I know staff is working to balance that very important priority with making sure that we don't increase barriers to housing. And I just want to say both of those things are equally important to me. I value the greenway space. I'm hearing clearly communicated how important it is from people in our community, from our stakeholders. And but it's also important for us to not increase barriers to housing. And so I don't have any specific questions that I would like to have answered tonight, but I would like to have a better understanding of the relationship of the neighborhood plan and, for example, special area zones in relationship to all of the pieces, the clear and objective code, goal 15, the water overlay resources, which one takes precedence and how do they interact with each other? I think that's an important piece for us to understand, and I would love to hear more about that in the future. I did notice a thread throughout many of the comments, starting right back in batch 1, that there are concerns about the maps that will be utilized and provided through this process to make decisions, but also at a later date. And so I hope we could also get some information about what would a developer be confronted with when they're looking at the maps that will ultimately come out of this project, and how will the community have access to that type of information. I think the information that Jeff mentioned earlier is really helpful, the interactive one in particular, but we've been adding pieces to it as we go. So how are we going to build in the additional work that staff has done in the mapping? I found Commissioner Edwards' comment about the discretionary track to be very helpful. I can't ever remember this planning commission simply doing away with a discretionary track, a discretionary code. It feels very much outside the scope of this particular project. And at the same time, I'm not sure where that leaves us with the discretionary track, except for, again, perhaps the state government needs to deal with that issue. So I appreciate that we might need to take a look at it in the future, but I do see that as somewhat outside of this scope. I think those are a couple of the big questions I have. I need to understand how all the pieces will fit together in order for me to start really looking at some of the specifics. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fragala. Commissioner Lear, for round 2.
Yes, thank you. And just want to thank Commissioner Fragala for calling out how important it is to respect and that complex balance between this opinion that we've heard so heartfeltedly presented about preservation of the Greenway versus the goal of not standing in the way of, more housing and multifamily development, and how challenging, that could be in an area like this. One thing that I was kind of wondering, and this is also in response to Commissioner Isaacson's comment that, perhaps nothing we're doing here today would prevent the construction of additional housing. and this might be really challenging for staff, so I'm not trying to make a request that asks you all to bite off a ton, but if there's any way to quantify how some of these rules actually affect the cost of development, because there are opportunities to use rules and new requirements to effectively prohibit development by making it prohibitively expensive. And so just with respect to trying to achieve and be concerned for that balance, I've been thinking through, I'm not sure exactly how that could happen, but maybe there's a hypothetical example of, you know, what it costs for development or construction costs, and some attention could be paid to, you know, how the proposed rules would add to that and whether it makes certain developments or most developments infeasible. I'm still thinking that through a little bit. If you have any ideas, I'm certainly open to them, not trying to ask you to look at every one of these plots and how the rules would affect them, but I do think it's worth mentioning. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Lear. Hopping back in for myself for round two, just a follow up to my last comment. Jeff, I know I hear what you're saying about that there are existing mapping tools to allow people to kind of see where development is possible. I guess it kind of underscores a kind of a current of conversation within multiple communities in our area that I've heard from, which is those who know how to use that software, that makes sense. But for the average person who hears we're going to be building 6-story buildings right next to the Greenway, they're not going to use that mapping software, right? They're not going to see where this development is. And so part of our job needs to be assuaging those fears with the realities of what we're trying to do to kind of thread the needle between what is really happening, where development is possible, where it's not, so that we can all come to a conclusion that incorporates everyone's viewpoints as best as possible. So I understand that what I asked for in terms of a total white Greenway approach may not be possible between now and when we come back. Could you pick 5 lots that the 100-foot setback seemingly would say development is possible, but once you add in some more elements, now all of a sudden it's not. So people have an idea to be able to say, okay, when I'm looking at a map, when I'm seeing what's out there, here's an example of where that wouldn't be possible, or where there would be changes to be possible, so that people have an idea to be able to formulate this a little bit better for the layman.
Commissioner Isaacson, I appreciate that idea. It's certainly more manageable to provide a select set of examples, and I think, you know, well, I need to talk with the staff team about what we can actually accomplish between now and the next meeting, but I appreciate the intent and the goal of that, to really look closer at the feasibility of development given the new standards. And it's an important question and something that we do need to understand. And so I think part of what we'll do is explore what sites make sense, and we'll huddle among staff to figure out what would be helpful in terms of representing different examples in the way that you described. And we'll bring it back. Yeah.
Thank you. Do any other commissioners have any thoughts they'd like to offer? Commissioner Beeson, you haven't. I just want to make sure you have the opportunity if you would like to say something.
You know, I'm appreciating all the comments I've heard and the questions I've heard. I don't have particular questions. I've been going through the testimony pretty carefully. I guess I'm expecting there'll be more coming in. I've gone back and looked at kind of what we did when we started this back in March a year ago, tried to follow through. And I think we've made pretty significant progress in addressing a lot of the comments that have come through, particularly from the River Road community, the River Road organization, John Belcher's letter, and so on. So I guess I want to kind of continue to digest all of that. I'm agreeing with Commissioner Fragola. I think at least one of the things I was kind of hearing in there, I'm still, you know, the idea of being sure that, I mean, I'm understanding what we're doing is being sure we're remaining consistent with the requirements of Goal 15 or with the state goals. I think we're far as I can see that we're doing that. So I guess I just want to kind of continue to review it and be ready to, I would also agree with Commissioner Fraggle. I'm not expecting we'd be ready to make any kind of recommendation on the 24th, but I think I just want to be in a position to kind of weigh in and deliberate on this thing. And I will say, I think we've, again, I'm being a little repetitive here, but I think we've come quite a ways in drafting a set of code requirements that I think achieve the objective as I originally understood it, which is to provide clear and objective standards for housing development there. So I guess I'm doing pretty well, but I don't have particular questions tonight. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I think thank you all for joining us and speaking tonight. We'll be back on January 24th to begin our deliberations on this item. As mentioned, any written testimony provided by 5 p.m. on January 20th will be given to us, and any testimony submitted after that time will be provided to the City Council. I also want to thank the public, especially staff and our moderators for tonight. I think that it was incredibly informative for me personally. I know the rest of the commission would probably feel the same way. So I will close this meeting and we are adjourned. Thank you.